Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. The subject of water innovations is, as Earl noted, certainly an issue of increasing importance here in California and certainly around the country increasingly and around the world, as I'll show in a few examples today. I want to start off by some things that are probably pretty obvious, but I think need to be sort of laid out as important parameters. We know that climate change, food and energy needs, and urbanization increasingly threaten our freshwater supplies. And while we're going to continue to use a lot of conventional methods of water supply to address those issues, addressing these issues is going to increasingly require us to adopt what I will call, for the sake of simply a descriptor, unconventional alternatives. And to lay it out, these are things, as we're going to see in a few moments, wastewater reuse, stormwater harvesting, even desalination. And of course, conservation, extremely important. But really want to focus on supply alternatives for the most part. My research is focused around this third bullet, which is the speed and the degree of the penetration of alternatives, which I would argue is contingent only partly on technical constraints. It's really contingent on satisfying a whole series of societal issues. And so the question that I raise for you, and a question that I continue to raise in my own work, is what factors explain the acceptability of innovations? This is a real advertisement, by the way, for a bottled water product called Porcelain Springs. And some of you might remember or recognize the actor Wilfred Brimley at the bottom, who's endorsing this product. The joke, I suppose, is perhaps on the user or perhaps on those who are reluctant to drink recycled wastewater. But the idea is that this is a safe, secure product that has been ensured through the marvels of science. And if a grizzled Hollywood star can endorse it, what more could society possibly need to know about drinking recycled wastewater in bottled form? Well, a lot of things about that picture are still unsettling, and that is the fact that public acceptability is more than just good science, and it's certainly more than just having a Hollywood actor promoting something. I want to just focus momentarily on a couple of aspects of the problem and why this is a challenge. And I want to use a couple slides to talk about a global view and a local view of water demands, water supply. Over the course of the last century, as many of you know, world water use has grown tremendously. But the reasons for the growth are not simply more people. Because in fact, in a lot of places, including here in Southern California, per capita, per person water use has actually remained relatively stable for a number of years. But worldwide, water demands have risen more than sixfold, more than twice the rate of population growth, largely due to food and fiber production. And also, secondly, the growth of municipal uses. So increasingly, what I think this figure underscores is that worldwide, demands for water for agriculture are going to put in certain societies, including California, increasing pressures on alternatives for water. And then increasingly, we can see global demand competition as between these two large forces, agriculture and cities. A little more local view. There's been a tremendous amount of research, as all of you know, on climate change and water supply. We could cite any number of figures, any number of studies, but these are a couple studies that I find particularly compelling. One on the left is from the Global Change Research Program, the last report they did in 2014, which looks at projected snow water equivalent. I don't have to tell you in this audience that here in Southern California, both in the Inland Empire and on the coast, this is very critical. A decline in available snowmelt means a decline in available water supply from our traditional sources, State Water Project, the Colorado River, and so forth. And it looks like the future is going to portend some fairly dramatic changes. On the right, I've often shown this figure to my students. This is historical supply and demand issues regarding the Colorado River. This is figures from the Bureau of Reclamation. And my students have often asked me, gee, if this is true, it means that the allocation of the Colorado River will be more than the available supply. Yeah, that is of course true, and we know that's true, and it's even true today. At the top right is a snapshot from an article that some colleagues of mine wrote that came out of a symposium we had through Water U.S.A. a couple of years ago called Water and Climate, Recognizing Anthropogenic Drought. And our hypothesis was not really very sophisticated, but we think may be important to animating this debate. And it basically comes down to these 5 bullet points in the bottom left. That droughts may come and they may go, but managing these various water supply and demand threats requires that we figure out a way to reduce demands, avoid wasteful uses, become more efficient in the way we use water, reusing every drop, there's the wastewater reuse, and harvesting new sources to the extent possible. How we do that, though, is the big puzzle. We know that anthropogenic pressures worsen drought, but what do we do to make up for that? This is a figure that is generated by the Department of Water Resources in Sacramento, and what you have here are 2 estimates of where our future water alternatives are likely to come from. On the one hand, you see in the sort of lavenderish purple, light purple color, the low estimate, which means if we don't do any added investment, where is our future water supply likely to come about? And then the high estimate, if we really exerted extra effort, extra investment, extra education, extra work to actually get these things adopted, what would the alternatives likely be? And the important thing about this figure, this is statewide, so obviously within California, sources of supply are going to vary. But I would point out to you a couple things that are really important about this figure. The biggest gains, it is estimated, are likely to come from conservation, underground storage, of course, where are you going to get the water to store, and then recycled municipal water. As I tell my students, cloud seeding, probably not so much. You need clouds, and we don't have a lot of those in California, as we know. And if we did, there's all kinds of legal issues that we know in the past involving cloud seeding. So alternatives are available, but what alternatives do we actually adopt? And here's where the social science comes in. In answering my rhetorical question as to what makes an option acceptable, I start, as most of us start when we do research on these subjects, with established theories. And social science research on the human dimensions of water alternatives suggests that public acceptability toward the introduction of any new option, whether it be reuse, desalination, stormwater harvesting, other technologies, are affected by 3 big domains. And these are domains that are researched by social psychologists, political scientists, economists, sociologists, even cultural anthropologists, and others. Urban planners, I'll just throw that in as another example of a discipline that studies these issues. The first is fairly self-explanatory, public perceptions. The extent to which positive message via family, peers, colleagues are available, very importantly, are seen as trustworthy. Think about that first slide, the porcelain springs water. With respect to the needs for water and the efficacy of the technologies. And there's been a lot of fairly recent research. Dolnikar and his associates have done a lot of research on this and continue to put out papers on this subject globally, not just in California and the U.S., but around the world. A second constraint, however, a second set of theories revolves mostly in the urban planning domain, but also affects other social sciences. And here, it's the built environment, constraints afforded by the contact with water, how we are affected by, for example, recycled and desalinated water. Is it direct through ingestion, through swimming, through bathing, or more indirect, for example, landscape uses, agriculture? If the water innovations are being applied sort of indirectly to our contact, we might find them more acceptable than if it's direct. And then thirdly, and this is an area that I find particularly appealing as a political scientist, as we're going to see in a few moments, is the built environment and governance. How do we actually manage these problems by way of law, regulation, and negotiation? Lots of water management principles have nothing to do with formal laws or regulations, but a lot between agencies, stakeholders, and discussions and negotiations of various sorts. Are decision makers ultimately regarded as competent and trustworthy? And are their decisions seen as big criteria, justified, fair, reasonable, and perhaps most importantly of all, carefully considered? Have you looked at every option? Are we ensured that all of these options are encompassed? These factors influence acceptance of interventions to increase alternative supply sources, as well as the efficacy of, say, public information campaigns. And we've seen this in my own research and my colleagues' research here in the United States, in Australia, in Western Europe in particular, Israel, and elsewhere. So taking that theory, how can we perhaps put it into practice? And this is something that I developed, and in a recent book I wrote called Water Politics, tried to develop this as a kind of a rubric. And basically, what I'm trying to do is to develop a sort of screening approach to think about the acceptability of options. And if you start from the top and work your way down, this is a kind of a formalized way that stakeholders approach the issue of alternatives. And I think this is empirically largely true, though I'm continuing to do work on this, very interested in your feedback as well. But basically, as one moves downward, the factors affecting acceptability become more complex and challenging and require a greater inclusion, key point, of non-experts. Not just what experts say is acceptable, but what non-experts believe is acceptable. So we start with technical feasibility. Do the basic science and engineering support a particular approach? And this is something that we know is determined often by engineers, by water resource planners. And the focus is on performance relative to expectations. Do these technologies actually work as advertised? And then we move down to how much does it cost? And upon whom will those costs fall, the burden of the costs? Is it affordable? Key phrase, relative to likely alternatives. We know, and many of you have studied this issue, we don't look at an alternative's cost in isolation. We look at it through a life cycle of comparing likely alternatives. Economists have a role in this, as do planners. Elected officials are certainly interested in these questions. And the focus is on both equity and efficiency. And then there's environmental impact and risk. What are the effects of an option on the environment and on public health? And can these impacts be mitigated satisfactorily? Risk analysts, health and ecological scientists, and here we really begin to see the members of the public begin to chime in their concerns. And so the focus is on potential hazards and whether they can be mitigated. And then last but not least is public embrace and engagement. How does the public perceive the benefits and the costs and the risks? And do they trust the institutions charged with managing the alternatives? Social scientists in general can have a lot to say about this. Elected officials certainly are interested in this. But members of the public that are engaged in various forms of public participation are particularly attuned to this issue. And this is what we're seeing globally when water innovations are either introduced or discussed to be introduced. That suddenly it moves from the realm of simply expert debate to a broader public engagement process. And I believe this is going to be one of the challenges that we're going to be faced in water management for a long, long time. So let's talk about some options. A lot of detail here I apologize for. Please keep these and use these in any way you want. But I want to start with a couple of options. And I want to keep the focus initially on California, but we're going to move globally. Desalination. Many of you know the largest desalination plant in California was opened in December of 2015 down the coast in Carlsbad, San Diego County. Nearly $1 billion project. Water unit cost is about $1,800 an acre foot. Went up and running fully, 50 million gallons a day, serving some 300,000 people. Some would say copious energy use, but perhaps compared to the options, not so bad. And to be permitted, entrainment, brine disposal issues had to be satisfactorily resolved. Why is desalination so energy intensive? I'll let this diagram from Science magazine speak for itself, but basically tremendous energy consumption in the reverse osmosis process. This is improving over time, the efficiency, but it's still a fairly energy intensive process. What is surprising to many people is there is a robust legal regime in California and elsewhere that regulates desalination. And in fact, from the Desalination Planning Handbook, which is about 10 years old now, there are issues that have to be addressed, and they are, by anyone that wants to build a desal plant, ranging from ecology to siting and habitat to impacts on population growth, energy consumption, public health, and other regulatory requirements. So what's the issue? Well, I call this, with a question mark, deal breakers. That is to say, are there concerns that sort of go beyond the expert realm and bring us into this realm where somehow or another negotiations or assuaging public concerns needs to be entertained? And I want to start with the energy and environmental and rate concerns. I would contend, based on the research that I've done and my colleagues have done, these are important issues, but they can be addressed. For example, by having on-site generating plants. This is one of the things that was true in Carlsbad. You had a readily available energy source. The use of near-ocean diffusers to reduce brine concentrations. From a regulatory standpoint and from an ecological standpoint, seems to pass muster. And in terms of the cost to the consumer of desalinated water, you can negotiate vendor and water agency agreement on rate caps. And Poseidon, the builder of the Carlsbad plant, did this with the Metropolitan Water District to cap the price at 20% over regular MWD rates. That's the good news. But site-specific issues globally might be a little bit more intractable. And three questions that we see in case studies that we've done and others that are really important in understanding public acceptability of desalination. Is the water needed? And can the needs be met by other sources? In California currently, some agencies over in my neck of the woods, the Irvine Ranch Water District, for example, would say, we don't need desalinated water. We have other options available to us that are less expensive and more publicly acceptable and more easily pass muster. In other places, such as Israel and Singapore, the answer may be a categorical no. We need this. And not only do we need it, but we are willing to wage the kind of public information campaign necessary to see it adopted. Are future sources of energy available? And are they affordable and reliable? One of the issues that is confounding the possibility of siting desalination plants, for example, in Huntington Beach or in Dana Point in Orange County, is the fear that with the closure of the San Onofre nuclear plant, and the question as to whether or not renewable energy sources will come online quickly enough, will there in fact be a long-term stable energy supply to support desalination? Site-specific issue. And are other sources more publicly palatable? In some places, in Australia, for example, where desalination has been adopted, in Queensland, desalination was seen as more acceptable than wastewater reuse. There was a campaign in Queensland, particularly in Brisbane, to decide what sort of long-term investments will be made. Agency officials initially wanted reuse because they thought it was easier and this technology more straightforward to their needs. But public protests led to desalination as the more palatable option. Ironically, that may not be the case in Southern California. Quick footnote, why desal as opposed to reuse in Queensland? It turned out that when you investigate the actual details, water agency officials did not do a very, very good job of conveying how they would mitigate any possible risks from reuse. They did not make a convincing argument, and that really rose to the level of public protests, and once you get to that level of social movements, agencies are quick to abandon and move on to another option. Wastewater reuse. Let's talk a little bit about that. Again, a Southern California perspective for starters. The largest wastewater reuse plant for potable purposes in North America is in Fountain Valley, the groundwater replenishment system. That should be clue number one. It's not called the wastewater reuse system. It's called the groundwater replenishment system, which is a very accurate characterization because it's an indirect potable reuse system that recharges the groundwater basin in Orange County. And in addition to providing a water source for some 2 million people, it also provides a seawater barrier. So it has multiple benefits to water agencies and to the public. And in terms of long-term sustainability, that's a very important resource. So if you think of it as a combination of options that really carries a lot of cachet with the public, that was one of the public acceptability victories that the Orange County Water District managed to score. But it didn't stop there. It reduces the need for imported fresh water and it reduces wastewater pollution. By reducing the needs for imported fresh water, that also held sway with members of the public who were concerned about limits to growth, limits of residential growth in Orange County if future water supplies could not be assured. Top left is a map of the district. It uses not only, of course, recycled wastewater, but it also harvests some storm water off the Santa Ana watershed and uses both of these to recharge the groundwater basin. Stages of wastewater treatment, as you can see, advanced treatment methods, all of these are used in Orange County, and they're very, very sophisticated measures. But I want to draw your attention very briefly to this chart at the right. Basically, what we see in purple is a gradual increase in the spreading, that is to say, the recharge of the groundwater basin over time through recycled wastewater. The hope is that this will continue on an upward trajectory and eventually help free the region from overdependence on continued imports from outside. Very important. So what about deal breakers? Well, again, you can go back to the original slide I showed you at the top of my talk, the derision by some as this method as toilet to tap, and concerns over other health impacts. These are important. Again, when you look at case studies and you investigate them deeply, you find these can be overcome as potential deal breakers if all feasible options are assessed and compared. Again, this is something that was done in Orange County, has been done in other parts of the world where reuse has been popularly accepted, as we'll see later, Australia. Where management and oversight institutions are perceived as trustworthy and competent through transparency and continuous monitoring. Outreach is something that Orange County Water District has scored very high on. And the technology must be brought in on time and within budgets. And that was also true in Orange County. Fiscally conservative area. Can you really build this plant and bring it online on time and within the costs that you estimated? The answer was yes and yes. And that's a good way of embracing public concerns in a place like Orange County. But some more site-specific issues could be intractable. Is implementation viewed as equitable? Locating facilities in less affluent areas or those with environmental justice legacies may arouse distrust, especially among underrepresented groups. And when you look at Los Angeles's attempts at instilling potable reuse in the San Fernando Valley, this is something that comes through very clearly in content analyses of media accounts and neighborhood meetings. And is the water needed? And can, more importantly, can it be graded, in a sense, to various end uses, as is done in Israel and in Southern California and increasingly in Australia? That is to say, does all of the recycled water have to be for potable uses, or can some be for other uses, thereby freeing other sources for potability? And does it meet community aspirations? This is something that increasingly we're finding to be true globally. Is it an incentive for added growth? This was a deal breaker, or has been, at least up until this point in time, in the San Fernando Valley. This can be both a plus and a minus. In Orange County, the availability of recycled wastewater assuaged concerns that Orange County would not be able to continue to grow. In the San Fernando Valley, the promise of recycled wastewater proved to be a negative. We don't want more growth. We want to limit growth, and an affordable, available source of resilient water supply is not what we want. And then to this environmental justice question, I would direct you to the survey that was done about 11 years ago now by the San Diego Institute for Policy Research. This was confined to San Diego County, and it was an examination of whether or not the public would find direct, not indirect, but direct potable reuse to be acceptable. And the interesting thing is that 90% of residents stated that availability was a serious problem, but only less than half favored potable reuse. Race appears to be a factor. The strongest support was among whites and Asian Americans. When you go to Latinos, for example, and African Americans, less support and greater opposition would arise. And newer residents of the community, which is to say those really from outside California who never in their lives imagined that they'd had to reuse sewage for drinking water. So these are some concerns that we continue to see resonate. And then finally, the option of stormwater harvesting. It's being done. Los Angeles, just to use an urban example, wants to increase its use of stormwater capture to recharge the San Fernando Basin. The value of the water to the Department of Water and Power is extremely high, both for recharged water and for directly used stormwater that could be harvested and applied to parks and public areas. So these are real monetized benefits. But of course, to reap these benefits, as is true with stormwater harvesting anywhere, you have to be prepared to implement low-impact measures to capture the runoff, and of course, the health risks of various applications must be monitored. At the bottom is a schematic of how LA, DWP, and the City of Los Angeles hope to and plan to harvest stormwater and use it. But there are questions locally that have been raised in California as well as elsewhere about whether or not water collected, let's say, off your roof is safe, and how does it affect edible plants. Roofing materials, air quality, slope of roof, temperature, all kinds of questions that can arise and need to be mitigated. So what do we know? Deal breakers. Well, it's both a resource and a pollutant source, but concerns again can be resolved if the costs of stormwater impacts are ascribable on property owners. This is something we've seen, for example, in Australia, as I'll note momentarily. And the accurate volumes of harvestable water and the cost to treat it must be well established. This continues to be a challenge here in California and in other parts of the United States. And local agencies have to collaborate on projects. This is something in California, Prop 87, Prop 1, other proposals have encouraged, but working together to share costs, plan projects, and operate them still remains a bit of a hurdle. What kinds of projects can you develop that would be seen as equitable and cost beneficial to multiple communities? But there are some more difficult challenges, and these revolve around legal barriers. In California, for example, would anti-degradation policies apply to the harvesting of stormwater for groundwater recharge? This is an issue that's been raised by many areas of the state that are contemplating stormwater harvesting. It's an unknown. Can risks from pathogens and microbes from roof runoff be overcome? This is a concern that was raised about 5 years ago by the National Academy of Sciences. And assuming those two things could be resolved, can divergent public health standards for treatment and end uses be reconciled across agencies and across jurisdictions? This is a big question that remains unanswered in terms of public concerns. A few years ago, some colleagues of mine and I wrote an article in Science on looking at stormwater harvesting alongside other options. And basically we concluded that from a both technological and policy standpoint, what needs to be done is you need to use the household, the obvious end use, as the focal point and then figure how incrementally you could enhance water supply through stormwater harvesting without simply obviating the other established water supply sources. Somehow hook the plumbing together, reduce the costs, and make it all publicly acceptable. And that's what we tried to demonstrate in this paper. So let me turn, finally, to some international lessons that may shed light on these options and alternatives and what we need to learn. And I'll start with wastewater reuse and kind of some global examinations of this issues. And I'm going to start with the issue of governance, which is an issue that's close to my heart. Israel, big user, Malta, Singapore, Australia, and so on down the line. Reuse seems to be most widespread from a governance standpoint, where national governments encourage it through both regulation, that is to say establishing national standards for use, and some subsidy, because there has to be an assurance that these projects can be brought online, particularly in areas that may not be able to afford, like Orange County, to develop their own system. But there also has to be a wide latitude for local adoption, which means how you use it and where you use it. And importantly, other options are found to be less, let's say, practical when you actually do head-to-head comparisons. An example that I will use is Australia, where my colleagues and I have done a lot of work on site, working with colleagues at Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, and other places. During Australia's millennium drought at the beginning of the 21st century, wastewater reuse was really advocated strongly by a number of water agencies in both Sydney at the bottom, Melbourne at the top right. And in order to get wastewater reuse acceptable, both Sydney and Melbourne, which is to say the states of New South Wales and Victoria, did something that they had not really done on a very conscientious basis before. They used the millennium drought as a catalyst for conducting a series of public focus groups, visioning sessions, statewide, to engage water users as well as water agencies in an actual dialogue, a conversation, looking at various water options and encouraging a culture of community involvement and innovations. It energized officials to adopt a wide range of options and to look and cost them out and to analyze their pluses and minuses. And it encompassed public concerns about costs, risks, and impacts from all options. It turns out that recycled wastewater use, in addition to conservation and stormwater harvesting, did catch on dramatically in both Sydney and in Melbourne. In the case of Melbourne, a number of agencies had to be brought on board, not only urban agencies in Melbourne, but throughout the state of Victoria, a number of agricultural irrigation districts which adopted various grades of reused wastewater. Now, the one thing I will say about this is on the top slide, which refers to Melbourne and Victoria. After the millennium drought ended, or perhaps I should say after the government declared the drought emergency to have ended, wastewater reuse declined. So this was seen as a palatable option, but it was not seen as a sustainable option. If other options were available, they would take the first preference. During an emergency, reuse would be seen as the more desirable option, particularly for potable uses. For non-potable uses, it's continued. For potable uses within the city, declined. Same thing happened in Sydney. Briefly, discerning needs, desalination and reuse in Israel. A lot that can be said about this. Many of you are experts on this. But there has long-standing a deep awareness of the limits of Israel's natural water resources, which led to an early adoption of an integrated water management approach. And following a very severe drought in 2000, the Knesset concluded that the nation faced an urgent shortage, worsened by fragmented bureaucratic authority, in the words of a Knesset report. And an Israeli water authority, formed in the early 2000s, was empowered to do a number of things: to increase water prices, to reduce allocations to farms, and to distribute water savings devices. But both desalination and wastewater reuse, which account for a very good portion of Israel's supply, desalination mostly for cities, treated wastewater mostly for agricultural irrigation, came about in large part because there was a broad consensus, we would argue, that both allowed concentrated power in the hands of an agency to cut through a lot of the regulatory hurdles and the economic hurdles, but also the fact that water and food security are deemed critical. And thus there is broad consensus not only in support of the alternatives, but broad consensus in support of the competence and trustworthiness of agencies to carry through on these options. Stormwater harvesting, very much adopted by many of our colleagues in Western Europe. I'll let you read through these briefly, but basically in both Denmark and in the Netherlands, increased flooding, which has been attributed to climate variability, if not an absolute direction in climate change, has led major urban areas, Copenhagen and Rotterdam, to consider various options. And what's interesting is, in this case, I'll start with Denmark, expensive upgrades to storm sewers were considered, but in light of climate change, the city decided to adopt large-scale, low-impact development over a 50-year period. Basically, they're going to tear out streets, they're going to put in pavers, they're going to put in more parks, they're going to do everything they can to harvest stormwater. And it'll be $1.5 billion, but considerably cheaper, they believe, than a stormwater collection system. Policies will transform portions of the city to green space and collect stormwater in tanks and rain gardens. Green roofs will be encouraged, are encouraged. And LID investments were more cost effective. That was important in Denmark, where the government is running a deficit. In the Netherlands, a similar situation. This is obviously a country that's had incredible experience with flood management. Here, the problem was urban stormwater. And what the city of Rotterdam came up with is the world's first full-scale water square or water park, Bethlehem, which can retain nearly 2,000 cubic meters of water. Essentially, the innovation is to direct stormwater into the square, pooling it, relieving pressure on surrounding drainage facilities. Filters will keep the pooled water clean, and then during non-rainy periods, the plazas will be used as recreational centers for the arts, theater, music, public events. It's an innovation that was developed through the input of the city, the district water board, local residents, and students from an adjoining design school, which helped come up with this idea. So again, public engagement, looking at innovations. Briefly, stormwater harvesting in Australia. Here, urban planning and governance, very critical issues. Again, since the Millennium Drought, local governments have used zoning ordinances to encourage rainwater tanks for gardens and toilets and clothes and car washing. And rebates have been employed by local water agencies for water and sewer charges to property owners, basically boosting the amount of stormwater harvesting that's being done. As you can see, public engagement, signage indicating that more rain falls on Melbourne that can be used from dams, and equipping an entire cottage industry to install rainwater collection systems to actually be used in internal household appliances, RainWise being an example. A lesson, an important set of lessons, is that stormwater harvesting requires that public officials address many land use, public health, aesthetic, and urban design issues. And in Australia, the national government has legally distinguished, if you will, stormwater from rainwater. You might say, how do you distinguish the two? Rainwater, anything you capture on your roof and can store in a tank. Stormwater, everything else that flows off your property. This provides city officials, local officials, the capacity to actually incorporate firm numbers of harvestable water into plans for various forms of reuse. I want to wrap up by talking just about a couple of other global examples that sort of take us off of these stormwater and reuse and desalination options, but also are noted as innovators. Tokyo, Japan, conservation and reuse. Japan has long been a pioneer in household conservation. Smart metering is widespread in every urban area, small and large. But since the 1980s, per capita consumption has steadily increased in most cities, including Tokyo. So aggressive wastewater reuse has been introduced. This was not an easy thing to do in Japan. There are various religious, spiritual issues that had to be addressed. Stormwater harvesting for non-potable needs, gardens and parks, was widely adopted. Again, here the gain was the belief in the importance of gardens and parks to urban life, and restrictions on groundwater withdrawals to avoid further land subsidence. This has been a huge issue in the Tokyo Bay region. An explicit concern with climate variability has been employed by water agencies, especially local heat island impacts on water use. So this is something that's gotten people on board with these alternatives over and above conservation. Last but not least, China. Much of my recent research has looked at some of the efforts of China to continue with what we might call the conventional strategies. Many of you in this room are familiar with Three Gorges Dam, world's largest water project, but fewer know about the South to North Water Project, which was conceived in the same era, the 1950s, at an estimated cost of some $62 billion, greater than Three Gorges Dam. And it's basically a transfer system, an interbasin transfer system to take some 12 trillion gallons a year from the Yangtze to the Yellow River Basin, moving south to north. The water would be provided for domestic and industrial use for some 20 cities. It would mitigate conflicts from competition. It would avert the overuse of groundwater, which has already occurred in many parts of eastern China, and it would help meet agricultural needs. There are, however, some unintended consequences, and this takes us back to why conventional methods are not by themselves assurable. Water quality seems to be worsening from runoff. The relocation of hundreds of thousands of people, again, we know that to have been true with Three Gorges. Most people this does not even register that this has occurred with this project. The diversion of the Hans River's flow, which has caused concentrations of pollutants, navigation restrictions, and fishery losses. And to pay for the project, water charges have increased, which has actually reduced the use of the water for low-value crops. So it's an unintended consequence, maybe a positive consequence. Bottom line here, China continues to rely on large-scale conventional projects. These are viewed not only as domestically beneficial, but as the rest of the world turns to the unconventional alternatives, it's a potential export industry. The building of dams in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Many of those projects are being built by Chinese engineering firms. And finally, I did want to say just a little bit about Cape Town. You've all been following the Cape Town saga. You cannot blame city officials for the drought, but in terms of public trust, governance, and urban planning, there do seem to be some emerging lessons. I wrote a blog on this recently for Edward Elgar, and one of the things that we found is that warning signs were ignored, poor crisis management was practiced, the city's water infrastructure has long struggled to keep pace with growing demands. Population has doubled since the 90s. And city leaders merely advise residents to become water aware rather than to take proactive steps. Back in 1990, there was a national government-sponsored water research commission which recommended wastewater reuse as a hedge against local reservoirs becoming depleted. This was something that was potentially forecast. But plans launched to make the city more resilient by diversifying supplies with wells and small desalination plants. There have been delays in completion, coupled with distrust over the city's promises not to shut off water in the so-called shantytown areas surrounding Cape Town, is posing many challenges. So in addition to all of the other physical and hydrological challenges of Cape Town's drought, this issue of public trust and regard for the capacity of government to intervene is going to be a very important issue moving forward. I want to close with a couple of thoughts. This table addresses where I think one of the great grand challenges of water alternatives is going to lie in the future, and that is this issue of environmental justice. On the top, what I call the traditional paradigm, which looks at risks to water as potentially high consequence and high in probability and falling on underrepresented populations. These would be threats to human health and well-being through pollutants and toxic wastes and reduced in-stream flows and so forth. These lead to high-intensity conflicts, as we've seen around the world, that may be accompanied by social protest, even violent demonstrations. And the impacts may be acute and short-term. Dam building can generate such environmental justice conflicts. Interbasin diversion, we know in California's history, the Owens Valley, can generate such conflict. Major pollutant spills, Basel, Switzerland, along the Rhine, or, lest we forget, Flint, Michigan, can generate this kind of social movement. And in many developing countries, the privatization of urban water systems. But that's easy. That's the traditional paradigm. We think we understand that. But there is a newer idiom, I would argue, that is emerging. And this is what we're seeing with water alternatives, and in particular in light of urbanization and climate change. The risks of water problems are potentially high consequence, but with also a high degree of uncertainty. Threats to health and well-being are possible, but the bigger issues right now seem to be concerns with broader welfare issues, cost, affordability, access, and actions to address or repair past legacies that remain unaddressed. Here, the nature of the conflict, I would predict, and we've already seen, is lower intensity in form. Social protests may occur, but what's more likely is that the problems will be perceived as chronic and long-term. There will be public resistance to dramatic changes, and we will see this in hearings and in public meetings and even social media campaigns. And we're seeing this in places like the San Fernando Valley with wastewater reuse. We see this in Orange County with some mobilization against desalination. We see this to reactions to the imposition of involuntary conservation measures. And we see this in water supply privatization issues, not in the developed nations, but here in the States. This is a newer idiom, no less challenging, but perhaps much more complex in its subtleties and what it will mean for long-term water supply planning. So I'll leave you with a couple thoughts. Every option has advantages and disadvantages, as we've seen. But rather than look for the best options in quotes, given what we know about social science research on acceptability, we need to seek the most adaptive solutions. And what are those? Well, let me suggest they're no single option, but an array of options that have to be adopted concurrently and conjointly. Those that have a low probability of failure, that rely on flexible solutions, that generate fewer negative consequences that are going to be costly to mitigate later on, that conserve resources for renewal and innovation. There we have to go beyond these supply options and look at innovative ways to conserve, and that incorporate lessons from previous experience. And as this Danish proverb says, predicting is definitely hard, especially when we're talking about the future. And with that, I thank you for your patience. I think there's a couple things that need to be done right out of the gate. One is that the proponents of reuse have to show that they're looking at the option in comparison to, and then there have to be comparisons. The public has to believe that you're looking at every option, that you're putting them on a level playing field, that you're looking at cost, you're looking at possible impacts and whether they can be mitigated. And then further to that point, there has to be some plan, some system in place for assuring the public that there's constant intervention in the form of monitoring and measuring of health impacts. Do we know for sure that you are looking at any potential health risks that may somehow get through all of these advanced treatment methods? And how do we know that? Transparency, very important. And I think a third thing, and this speaks to the advantages of the potable reuse of wastewater. In places like Orange County, if you happen to have a handy groundwater basin available and can actually transform reuse into a sustainable, resilient form of water supply by recharging your groundwater basin, and effectively, in the public's view, mixing virgin groundwater with recycled wastewater, you've got a good plan. Now, if you don't have that last option, it becomes more problematical. And we're seeing this in San Diego, we're seeing this in other places. You got it. You got it. Yeah.
Going back to your aquifer, not only do you need the aquifer, but you need the wastewater. What happens if Riverside decides to just send you our brine and recycle everything?
Man, that's a fantastic point, Kurt. And basically, this is, I think, one of the reasons, one of several reasons, why Orange County water agencies are looking long and hard at desalination, coastal desalination. That issue of the brine, and also, and the costs of removing it, but also the issue of, ironically, if you're reusing wastewater and you're encouraging a culture of conserving water, at some point, you're still going to have an additional supply, and you're not going to import it, and this is where desal comes into promise. And personally, I believe at some point in the future, it's got to be a big part of that mix. Question is, where do you put the desalinated water? Do you put it directly in the distribution system, or do you put it into the groundwater basin along with the reused water? That's a big cutting-edge debate that a lot of the water agencies locally are debating. It's a great question.
The last couple of slides sort of edged towards this, but you never quite addressed it directly. And the issue is, what role do you see as litigation having in terms of driving policy towards particular solutions? For example, I think you can make a pretty good argument that the state and federal water projects in California now are being operated in accordance with biological things.
Right.
It had relatively little to do with the original purposes of those projects.
That's right.
The consequence of that is that there's a good deal less water coming to Southern California
Right.
and the San Joaquin
That's a
Valley
great.
than was originally intended. Do you see that continuing? I mean, where do you see the role of litigation going in this, and is it a pendulum that will swing back?
Yeah, it's a great question, and could spend hours on that question, but let me give you a shorthand answer where I see it going. First of all, you're right. The litigation is often animated by concerns that are outside of the water supply issue, but are guided by things like the Endangered Species Act, public trust doctrine, and so forth. Those issues are going to become more salient in California and nationwide, or at least surrogates for the public trust issues are going to become salient nationwide. The other thing I would say about that is that litigation is increasingly an option not of last resort, as used to be the case, but of often first resort. So if protagonists see a problem or they see some threat to an interest, let's say it's biological, ecological concerns, threatened and endangered species, water rights concerns. This will be the first option because they feel they can get something that will kind of stop the policy process from going further. If you're trying to thwart something, the best way, well, not perhaps the best way, but one of the surest ways to do it is to stop it before it builds what's seen as a policy momentum moving forward. And I think we're going to see more of that. I think we're going to see it in terms of protagonists that are opposed to various innovations and also proposed to sort of, let's call them for the sake of discussion, conventional methods. Diversion, moving water from one basin to another, moving it from the Delta to Southern California, or building tunnels underneath the Delta, which is, I would still say, a conventional option. It's a hard engineering approach. I think we're going to see more litigation. I think it's inevitable, and I think confusion between different legal regimes, some that advocate protecting, let's say, biota at the expense of other concerns, and those that look at water rights as being supreme. That's where you're going to see a lot of the conflict, and I think it's going to play out in courts, and I think it's going to play out as well as in the court of public opinion. It's going to increase.
So my question is in regards to some of these regions like Australia and Israel.
Yeah.
When it came down to protecting water, how was this embraced in regards to agriculture?
No alternative, no choice, I think would probably be the shorthand answer. But I think beyond that, I think you're looking at two societies that have high levels of education, high levels of information, very open societies, and have sort of grappled with these issues for a long time and have looked at various alternatives. That's not to say they don't continue to grapple with them. I have colleagues in Melbourne, for example. One of the issues with recycled wastewater for agriculture that has arisen in Australia is the secondary impacts. So you apply recycled wastewater to grasslands, and then sheep that are grazing on the grasslands consume it, and then all kinds of biological processes in the sheep. The grass is one thing, and the soil uptake of any remaining contaminants is another, but how does it affect the lamb that I'm buying in the supermarket? Those are issues that are still being studied and investigated, because it turns out those are the issues that are most acute to the public. It gets back to public contact. I don't care if you apply it to grass. I don't play in grass, but I might eat lamb. So this is a very important issue. But in both countries, they've grappled with these and other options for a long, long time, and they really see themselves as having very few other options, very few choices, and confidence in the science, the technology, and the governance.